friends and colleagues, and friends. We had a dean in Geneva who, from time to time, specified his colleagueship, the way of his colleagueship with his colleagues, in saying, "Mes chers collègues et néanmoins amis," my dear colleagues and nevertheless friends. Since I hate culture, this was a joke, let me speak about the mind. And let me take, to begin with, a Kierkegaardian stance in asking rhetorically, what is the mind? Answer, the mind is the subject. And what is the subject? The subject is what is distinguished by self-consciousness. And what is self-consciousness? Self-consciousness seems to be, this is the widest spread answer Occident has given, a situation where the object, which typically is the about of a representation, is replaced by the subject itself. Instead of thematizing the window, I thematize the one who sees or attends to the window, and let this call the representational model. And I think it is mistaken, but it is and this is what I am to say thereabout. It is the more interesting to say that the representational stance is mistaken, as there has recently been built a new wave in analytic philosophy of mind, people who themselves call themselves or baptize themselves self-representationalists, since they think the essential thing about self-consciousness is that it not only represents something else, but in representing something else, is self-represented. I mentioned that this is part of a widespread conviction. Let us entitle this History Part 1, already defended by Aristotle, who in the Metaphysics and in De Anima from time to time made the point that psychic events, when occurring consciously, most of our mental events do not occur consciously. But when you answer to the question, what is consciousness, you may say, seldom it occurs, but when it occurs, it is the fact that apart from having an external content, these psychic events capture themselves en par ergo. And Franz Brentano, famously adopted this formula and quotes it in lots of his writings, for instance, über das innere Bewusstsein. And the defenders of the shift of attention view, most of them being self-representationalists, the idea is that consciousness is concentrated upon its content, but marginally or peripherally also captures itself, and par ergo, peripherally. If there is little risk of disagreement on recognizing the phenomenon, philosophers widely disagree in the interpretation of the assumed registration mechanism. Most of them hold a higher order view, widespread throughout the tradition of modern subject philosophy, not only in the so-called HOMT theory, higher order monitoring theories, the best known defender of which is David Rosenthal, as you know, or Carruthers or William Lycan. But there are classical illustrations of the higher order view. Let me mention three of them. Descartes, who notoriously says that what happens in having an idea being a mental act plus consciousness of there being a mental act, is that the mental act represents itself to itself. Que je me représente à moi-même. There is a famous formulation in his interview with Bormann, the Dutch interviewer, where he says, conscium esse, now he speaks not about cogitationis, but what makes a cogitatio a conscious cogitatio. Conscium esse est quidem cogitare et supra suam cogitationem reflectere. Similarly with John Sargent, a contemporary of John Locke, who contests Locke's view that thinking implies being aware of the fact that one thinks. He says, it is true that when I know that I think, I must reflect about my thinking, but the reflecting in turn is unconscious and has to wait for a third act, reflex act, and that way, on the top of the hierarchy of subsumed reflective acts, there remains an unconscious act on the top. So the entire change falls into the obscurity of ignorance. There comes no self-consciousness about, because the last act is not self-conscious. And third, Leibniz, who created the word, or at least made it famous, apperception, thinking that the basic category of the mental is to perceive, percevoir, corresponding roughly to what Descartes called cogitationes and what Kant and Reinhold called Vorstellungen. In distinct perceptions, the perception not only thematizes its content, but perceives itself. And in non-distinct acts, the perception is replaced by a self-feeling. Sensatio sui, sentiment de moi-même, sentiment de soi-même. Let's speak of the reflection model prevailing in all these examples, in these instances. Let's characterize the reflection model. It starts out from the assumption that self-awareness is a special case of hetero or object awareness, and that in principle all consciousness entails an inner accusative, separating content and vehicle into two, or creating two different contents, a primary and a secondary one. This is famously so called by Franz Brentano, as you know. The reflection model is a variety of the objectual view. By objectual, I translate Husserl's ungegenständliches Bewusstsein. Husserl was one of the first, but not really the first, who thought some conscious is not objectual, but is kind of self-illuminating, like pains and sensations, whereas others, which he called acts, are intentionally directed on something different from themselves. The objectual view wants that consciousness is in principle intentionally directed upon objects external to and different from the conscious act itself. The point is that it is essential to consciousness to be representational. That means consciousness of. There is no consciousness without an aboutness. In other words, there is no non-objectual consciousness. There's no consciousness without having an object. B, self-awareness is supposed to be objectually, gegenständlich, or representationally directed upon itself. This is what I called substitution of the hetero-directedness of the consciousness by a self-directedness of consciousness. The object, typically outside, is replaced by the subject itself, but the model remains the same. Self-consciousness is a case of intentionality. Now, my conference would be useless if there weren't problems with the reflection model. Let's begin by an analysis of what the word reflection literally means. Bending representationally back upon oneself and thereby realizing who or what one is, who or what I am. I leave open here if consciousness must be I consciousness, I owned consciousness, or if it also can be anonymous consciousness. In this case, the word reflection would mean a mental act is self-reflected as such without there being consciousness of an owner of the act. This is the no ownership theory defended by lots of people, for example by Ned Block, who speaks of consciousness without me-ishness. Sounds pretty Fichtean, by the way. But they learn things, these Brits and Americans. According to the reflection model, self-awareness is modeled on the schema of objectual consciousness, where vehicle and content, or primary and secondary object, according to Brentano, fall apart or asunder numerically, and often temporally too, nearly or roughly contemporaneously, says David Rosenthal about the second order act. It does not really, it is not the first order act, the one which reflects upon it. This view seems to lead into circular complications and infinite regresses. For how could the reflecting know that the reflected, in despite of its numerical otherness and difference, is she herself, if there is any gender in egohood, which I doubt, unless she had already been familiar with herself prior to the objectifying act of reflection. Here is an illustration of the classical criticism of the reflection model prior to Fichte's own criticism of his own beginnings, formulated in September 1795 already by Novalis, Friedrich von Hardenberg, who once remarked, what reflection finds appears to have already been there prior to the reflecting act. So the reflection can find what was known prior. Otherwise, the reflection wouldn't have found as a neutral scientific discovery, but created consciousness. But since there, according to the model, prior to the reflection, there wasn't any trace of consciousness, what reflection should find is, double point, unconscious mental act. But what reflection finds is consciousness. So consciousness, if found and not created by a kind of brainwashing, must have already been there. By the way, the formula of Novalis weirdly and astoundingly has been literally taken over by Husserl in his lectures on the inner consciousness of time, and twice by Sartre, quoting Husserl, of course not Novalis, who was first published in the last century in 1965 only. This was the first time that you could really know what the Romantics said. Hegel had no idea of all that. Okay, I skip. I just signalize that the main representatives of the self-representational view of self-consciousness agree entirely with Novalis. They read him. Too few of my publications are translated into English, and they read that Novalis said that and subscribed to it. It's entirely right. This is a good view on what a theory of self-consciousness has not to be. Now I come to history part 2. As all of you know, but it's worthwhile rereading it, that in 1966 appeared Dieter Henrichs' contribution to the Festschrift for Wolfgang Kramer called Fichte's Original Insight, Fichte's ursprüngliche Einsicht. Seldom has so much food been put into a nutshell, in so small a nutshell, let's say. The essay, bearing so unremarkable a title, delivers a diagnosis on why 300 years of penetrating thought about the internal structure of subjectivity have ended up so fruitlessly. So far, Henrich's essay is negative. It says what modernity has not succeeded to discover about self-consciousness. But at the same time, drawing upon a handful of classical, partly ignored or misjudged texts, a text misjudged or ignored by the grand course of history, partly expelled due to their non-conformism, Henrich delivers the gist of an alternative to the untenable reflection model. Self-consciousness, he says, is an awareness sui generis. This already provokes saying something like that in an English-speaking context makes you be banished out of the room. But more and more you read it in English. For example, Levine insists on self-consciousness being another kind of consciousness as representational consciousness. The famous Joe Levine, who invented the formula of the explanatory gap, all of you know that. He would agree, and he agreed with me thereabout. A, it is not the result of something whatsoever prior to it, as for instance an acting or a reflex act, you remember John Sargent, or a Fichtean Tathandlung, which by the way is a pleonasm, it suffices to act. It is not necessary to act or to intranslatable and therefore suspect of being senseless. B, nor does it consist in a two-place relation severing subject and object of the awareness, so keeping itself as event or act apart from the content. C, self-consciousness is strictly non-objectual. It is consciousness without thematizing an object. D, furthermore, it is non-conceptual. I is a rigid designator typically, but not classificatory. There's no sense of saying I open a class of egos. And E, it is not individuating. She who is being addressed by I is not identified thereby. This is roughly what Henri summarizes about the reflection model and why it is untenable. Fichte held the opinion that all his predecessors, and even Kant, this is remarkable, misconceived self-consciousness as reflection. 3 years later, or 4 years after the Wissenschaftslehre had been published, he learned it by perhaps Novalis, clearly by Hölderlin, who in the Palatorium Fichte gave in addition to his Platner Vorlesung, spoke with him, and we have a testimony of the content of this talk in one of Hölderlin's letters, which by a collector was torn asunder in 2 pieces, and on the most captivating passage, the rest of the letter has been lost. He would have been justified in adding that nearly all of his successors would be as well systematically mistaken about the non-reflective nature of self-consciousness. Fichte's consequence: there is no inner pointing to a mental state or its owner in self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is not the kind of consciousness in which objects are presented. Self-consciousness is radically non-objectual. It's not representational either. If representing is a two-place relation, whereas, according to Fichte, self-consciousness is precisely immediate, unmittelbar. There is no other thing via which it comes to self-awareness. It's no two-place act, but a one-place performance. It is a seamless, and object he helplessly formulates seamlessly, fugenlos, coincide. Sartre repeats that in saying, il n'y a pas de distinction sujet-objet dans la conscience de soi. There is no distinction between subject and object in self-consciousness, in despite of our need of using reflexive terms in speaking about self-consciousness. We have to distrust the way we speak about the phenomenon. Fichte showed this by a famous reductio ad absurdum. What follows is the reflection model, and Fichte tries to show how absurd it is. The defender of the reflection model says, consciousness comes about when an unconscious mental event is objectified by a higher level one, or by itself at a higher level. This is the self-representational view anticipated. The higher level mental event is itself first order and unconscious, and becomes conscious through objectification by means of a still higher level mental event that is itself unconscious, and so on and so forth. And so you may see, he adds, how you come to the conviction that you have a consciousness of yourself. According to this model, you shouldn't have any self-awareness. But since you have self-awareness, and facts can't be wrong, only theories can be wrong, you have to decline and you throw away the wrong theory and remain true to the fact. This is what he said in the last part. I come back to John Sargent, who already per absurdum had defended, you remember the reflection theory, came to the same result that there can't be any self-consciousness. Fichte says, no, there is consciousness. As phenomena can't be right or wrong, what is wrong must be the reflective theory. So another theory must be right. It is this one. All possible consciousness as an object for a subject presupposes an immediate self-awareness in which subjective and objective are absolutely one and the same. Otherwise, the fact of there being consciousness at all would be definitely unintelligible, unverständlich. So würde uns das Phänomen unverständlich. Now I set aside, I skip a problematization of Fichte's own theory, and come to self-representationalism, a theory developed during the last 10 or 15 years by young people. I'm happy to be in intense contact from time to time with. They learn about Fichte and take him seriously. They are astounded that precisely German idealism, which is a set of nonsensical pretensions and formulations, is in part lucid and even true, convincing, let's say. Until recently, Fichte's theory was entirely ignored in Britain and America. I know Henri's texts are translated into English, but even the English translation of Henri's text is too German for them. They can't read that. This is, even in English, this is just rubbish and trash and has to be put into where rubbish is to be put into. Thanks. Okay, the situation has changed with self-representationalism. These guys, as the name they gave themselves to their basic conviction, means that higher order theories, so let's say reflective theories, are mistaken. They lead into infinite regresses or circular involvements, complications, and what has to be put on their place. Let's begin with an analysis of what self-representationalism means. It rests on two premises. First, representation, therefore self-representationalism. Representation is the core necessary condition of consciousness and is in general the appropriate basic notion for any philosophy of mind, for any philosophy of the conscious mind. Remember the title of Chalmers' famous work, The Conscious Mind. The unconscious mind is here in this context without any interest. I'm not speaking about Freud or fiber stimulations or frequencies or amplitudes going on in the head. Second, those and only those acts or experiences, they translate by experiences, not Erfahrungen, but Erlebnisse, of course, may be passed as being conscious, which apart from their intentional or representational object, co-represent themselves, and par ergo. Self-representation is meant to be a constitutive condition, even though definitely a relation, a two-place state, showing a bipartite, please, how to translate bipartite? Bipartite, bipartite? They say bipartite. This is a quotation indirect. The core idea of self-representationalism, at least in Uriah Kriegel's version, can be summarized like this. Thus, whatever else a conscious state may represent, it always also represents itself, and it is, this is the constitutive part of the sentence, and it is in virtue of representing itself that it is a conscious act. So self-representationalism is not brought about by a higher order act, which differs numerically, temporally, even though typically it's one and the same token, but two types. Self-representing is different from representing something else. So there are two types taking place on one and the same token. This is their idea, which is pretty similar to Brentano's idea, and often they are called neo-Brentanists. by their hostile colleagues and nevertheless friends in the States. Rather, consciousness is built into the primitive first-order hetero-directed intentions from scratch. As consciousness presupposes self-consciousness, self-awareness is ubiquitous, whereas mental states occur as conscious, wherever mental states occur as conscious mental states. So the famous, the I think, is able to accompany all our representations, is taken literally, not only can, must be able to, but accompanies all mental acts provided they are conscious, except their being owned by an I. They renounce on the egohood condition and say, self-representing means that the mental is, so to speak, illuminated intrinsically, and not necessarily by someone who says it's me who thinks that. You may be in a state of narcosis, awakening from a narcosis, and you feel it hurts, it stings, it's not good, without knowing who it is to whom this occurs. This happened to me once in a very intense way and for a pretty long time. By the way, some psychologists, I speak of psychologists, not philosophers, agree with me, and some deny that. Some think it is a conceptual fallacy. And some say, maybe, can imagine that never happened to me. For example, Wolfgang Prinz in Bielefeld. Now, you may imagine that I'm in part happy about self-representationalism and in part not. They continue using the term representation as basic term of their theory of the mind for the sole and unique reason, I think, that representation can easily be naturalized. But this is of no interest for me. I'm not anti-naturalist, but I dwell on a level which is accessible to psychological description, to phenomenological diagnosis and analysis. Let's criticize representation as basic term. The first criticism may be that representation is a two-place relation, and we think of ourselves as one and not of two. We don't think that from scratch, by birth, we are schizophrenic in some way or other. The other is the presupposition of alterity. Typically, we think that representations are confrontational. Thinking a thing is meaning that we are not this thing. This is extremely present in Sartre, who says, connaître, c'est nier, c'est néantiser. Seeing the window is meaning I'm not a window, but a window is my object. This is the presupposition of alterity. This is different when we entertain an intention or attitude, given that intentions involve an aboutness, an object. When speaking of intentional relations, we typically make what Ulrich Pardai, in a not very considered but extremely well-written and intelligent book from 94, Identität, Existenz und Reflexivität, called the presupposition of difference, Verschiedenheitsvoraussetzung, or alterity. Comment to that, I abbreviate what I wrote. typically, when we say Peter pushed Paul into the water, we presuppose that Peter is not identical to Paul, so that Peter jumped into the water. So, in a pretty Wittgensteinian line, he recommends to avoid reflexive terms and to avoid the identity formula in general. Instead of saying, I mean Peter, and no entity without identity, Peter is identical to himself, I should say Peter, this is Peter, and this is Paul. This is enough. You have not to add, but Peter is identical to himself and Paul is identical to himself. And you see that in the strangeness of the explication of the comment you give to the phrase Peter pushed chucks Paul into the water. I meant that Peter jumped into the water, since I presupposed not the difference of both, but their identity. He sprang himself into he jumped himself into the water. Levine, whom I already mentioned, supports my view and said the notion of representation, which I suspect in this lecture, employed by the theory, by the self-representationalist theory, isn't adequate to capture the kind of awareness involved in conscious awareness. The problem, in other words, is that conscious awareness seems to be a sui generis form of representation. You have a quotation that some American philosophers of mind agree with Henri, and not merely because it is reflexive. So what Kriegel does to solve his problem is to compromise a bit with this two-states view. We have now a self-representation, but there are both of them. There's a subject and an object of the representation, one too much. And this is what Fichte, awkwardly, I agree, tried to suppress and to exclude in saying that in self-awareness we have not this separation, but that object and subject, content and vehicle of the act seamlessly and strictly coincide. We could let follow some semantic considerations about representing. Representing is typically representing something that stands for something else. For example, the flag for the unity of the American nation. But burning the flag is not burning the United States. The president is not so much aware of that, nor are the Palestinians, by the way, in burning the Israeli flag. But for us, both are different objects, and so are the subject and the object of a representation. This is different in an Erlebnis. The Erlebnis reveals itself the way it is, and not something else. Potast, one of the disciples or ex-students of Henri, speaks of the Innengrund of consciousness, which is, he says, non-confrontational. It is what it represents, but has not the representation opposed to the Erlebnis. Let me add another point. The self-representational explanation of awareness as being self-representation of a representation has problems with the Désir constraint. You know, the Désir constraint was famously introduced into the philosophical discourse by Hector Neri Castaneda in the 60s, in the middle of the 60s, and immediately after jubilatorily taken over by Sidney Shoemaker, Elizabeth Anscombe, then by John Perry, then by Roderick Chisholm, and finally by David Lewis in Attitudes, Dedicto, and Desé. The point Castaneda makes is that we cannot reduce self-knowledge. He's now speaking of self-knowledge, not of self-awareness, but the point is similar. In terms of propositional attitudes, or in terms of attitudes de re. You see that de re and dedicto are ways of speaking a la scholastics. They invented the differentiation between dedicto and de re. Speaking dedicto would be uttering a phrase, a complex sentence like that. Mary thinks of Mary, that Mary will be the next vineyard queen. I know this, and you this, Mary, when living in Schriesheim, north of Heidelberg. She believes of Mary, so of Mary is before, in the scope, and what follows is outside of the scope. She thinks of Mary, and she identifies Mary here, that Mary will be the next vineyard queen, but she may be mistaken about the identity of Mary. She thinks Mary is someone else. This may occur, and you just need to have some imagination to invent cases where this is evident. One case is the famous Ernst Mach case, who succumbs to a fallacy concerning his own identity. He once, a bit fatigued, entered a Vienna bus, and in the rhythm he took step after step, sees a man from the other side entering the bus in the same rhythm, and regarding this guy, he thinks, what a shabby pedagogue is the one who is just entering the bus, ignoring that he looked into a mirror glass without knowing it, and speaking about himself. If self-consciousness were consciousness of the right thing and having the right thought about the content, Ernst Mach would have had self-consciousness, but he hadn't, because he didn't conceive of Ernst Mach as being Ernst Mach. He took him for someone else. And this is a failure which can only occur de re. So you cannot replace the self of self-consciousness by a nomen, a noun, or a description, a definite description standing for this noun. Only when Mary thinks, Mary believes that she herself will be the next vineyard queen. She may be mistaken about her being the vineyard queen, but she can't be mistaken about the identity of the one he thinks about. Same thing is true with the attitude dedicto. If Mary thinks that Mary will be, now Mary is outside this scope, she does not think that of Mary, but she thinks that the following proposition is true: Mary will be the next vineyard queen. She may be mistaken. She may not know that she herself is Mary. But this is avoided as soon as you say, according to Castaneda and all these guys, Mary thinks that she herself will be the next vineyard queen. So we can't reduce self-consciousness to consciousness of something, to consciousness of an object, to objectual knowledge. So, this is my consequence, even the self-representational model must be sure that the representing and the represented are not only the same self-same person, but that they know them to be the self-same person. And this is not assured by the self-representational model. They are working about that, these guys. I had introduced, I had finished by a summary, which is useless. Let me now, because like the entire Henri school, I remained largely negative. I said what, according to me, self-consciousness cannot be. I did not say what then it can be, or how it has to be theorized adequately. Let me sketch a solution. Since there's nobody who knows what self-consciousness is, please practice the principle of charity with my attempt. What are we to do then? I'll base my construction on arguments borrowed from Michael Tye, the hardcore representationalist, Tyler Birch, another hardcore representationalist, and Jean-Paul Sartre. Tye's view, to begin with, is that, all of you know, but the way someone presents an argument is often revelatory, and so listen the way I characterize it. You may not agree and say this is not Tye's view. He thinks that consciousness is essentially intentional, and that qualitative content, the way it is like to me, the something it is like to me to be in a state, what Husserl and Meinung translated by zumute sein, wie ist einer Fledermaus zumute. This is a very Austrian way of speaking. I prefer it to the what is it likeness stance. That qualitative content, zumute sein, reduces to representational or intentional content. Content is largely determined by environmental facts like surfaces of physical object. This feels not so hard and not cold, for example. But this is due to the fact that the surface is the way I describe it and has nothing to do with my finger points or an introspectively discoverable inner feeling or a state of my subjectivity. It's a state of the reality I touch. Okay, consciousness on its part is diaphanous to outer facts to such an extent that it is entirely void of intrinsic properties. There is just one sole content, the representational one, and this is what is represented by consciousness. The roughness and the sweetness and the hardness and the coldness of outer objects. A question posed to Michael Tye. We invited all these guys to Tübingen. They spent a week with us. The seminary read their texts, and some participants prepared 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour talks to ask them the most urgent question we encountered while trying to digest the texts. How does consciousness, the representational vehicle, enter into the scope of consciousness? In other words, how does self-consciousness come about? Self-consciousness, not object consciousness, roughness consciousness, or qualitative consciousness come about. Radsky's and Tye's operation with a displaced perception or secondary seeing that P by seeing something not involved in the truth conditions for the proposition that P, for example, seeing that the thermometer mounts and so concluding that it has grown warmer outside. He thinks that we are aware of consciousness by kind of a displaced seeing. For how could displacement make truth conditions accessible which are not authenticated by the evidence of primary consciousness itself? It would be a mere conclusion, an inference. In fact, I should have had a consciousness of the window. There was a window, I saw it. In fact, I should have had consciousness. This is not at all what we think is self-consciousness, or not entirely. This point has been made more obvious, taking more seriously the point, how does self-consciousness come about under representationalist conditions, by Tyler Burge already in 1988. Differently than Ty, he recognizes Descartes' paradigm, according to which our knowledge or our awareness of propositional attitudes is direct, authoritative, self-verifying, and not only empirical. This is what Ty does not agree with at all. This premise seems to stand in flagrant contradiction to the anti-individualistic or externalistic thesis. This is a quotation too. What determines individuation of thoughts, propositional attitudes, cannot be accounted for individualistically. That means in the inner space of consciousness or psychology. It must be decided with regard to environmental facts. While functional evidence in psychophysical state of our mind remains the same, individuation depends partly on, and mostly, essentially, on physical influences emanating from the environment. Mental states are not only narrow states, but representation. Excuse me if I repeat what you already know. Narrow states are states how they feel. And wide content is what really is presented outside. You may not see something which has a reflex on your retina, and so in your narrow content there is nothing signalized or represented, but there's something outside. Or you think something is water, which is water, and so forth. Now Burge argues that these theses are compatible if, first, individuation of the wide content of thoughts is causally determined through the world, this being even true when I consider aspects of the world in appropriate dedicto attitudes, for instance, when considering that I'm now tasting watery stuff, be it X, Y, Z, or be it H2O. Second, if knowledge of the narrow content of my thought presupposes its external individuation, so there being a wide content, this is due to the second order or reflective character of thoughts. Content of thought known in self-knowledge is externally determined. Third, if reference and self-knowledge, first and second, occur in the unity of one and the same mental act, as they do in Brentano's doctrine of inner consciousness, not to be confused with inner observation. He says there is no inner observation because there are no objects presented to the mind. As soon as you consider, or as you observe, in effect, they disappear. For example, your anger, when observed, disappears, melts away, so to speak. But introspecting your anger does not make disappear the anger, but just testifies for its existence, for its presence, for its concurrence. Burge notes, it is thought and thought about the same mental act. He thinks, pretty like Brentano, but they don't read German text or Austrian text, even when they are translated. I consider that, and I also consider my considering that these are two types taking place on the same token. My comment, and I then come to an end, in presenting the Sartrean mediation between Burge and Tye. Burge does have an answer to how self-consciousness can coexist with externalistic determination of content. Content is being preserved in self-consciousness. We don't change content. First I have the wall, and second I have the one who considers the wall. But in the second order content, the first order content is fully preserved. Consciousness is like nothingness. There comes nothing into play over and above the objectification of this corner. Here's my trouble. Burge is entirely indebted to the higher order model. You remember he speaks of a reflective act that accompanies the first order act. Treacherous or revealing is his talk of a reflective judgment through which self-knowledge is supposed to come about. Reflection is a two-place relation which necessarily creates a content potentially different from the external one. Anyway, some amount of indecidability enters the transparency of the knowing monad. Now I let enter on the scene Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre, whom Colin McGinn recently called the most extreme externalist throughout the entire history of European philosophy, he wrote, which I think is not wrong at all. Sartre is better off. He agrees, he would agree, he of course did never read a line of Tye was a little boy when Sartre died. He agrees with Tye that consciousness is entirely transparent, diaphanous, to intentional objects and void of intrinsic property. There's nothing inside consciousness. Consciousness is expelling content out of it. According to the Twardowski formula, the basic operation of phenomenology is die Verstoßung des Gehalts aus dem Bewusstsein, the expulsion of content out of the consciousness in opposition to digestive philosophy, where the world is my representation and takes place inside. It's dangerous for the world to be represented by me because it disappears outside and reappears, re-emerges inside of my mind, in my mind, like the Bishop Berkeley, some Kant, A edition, and of course Schopenhauer. And phenomenally is a very hostile opposition to idealism, as digestive philosophy. The name comes from Sartre. Connaître, c'est manger des yeux. To know is eating with the eyes. No, not at all. It's the contrary. It's throwing up things outside of oneself. This is why the nausea is so important for Sartre. It evacuates its stomach and the objects remain pretty outside the consciousness. So Sartre agrees with Tye that there are no intrinsic properties of consciousness. It is due to the absence of intrinsic properties of consciousness that the consciousness is transparent to white content. This is his pointe, his salient point. The consciousness is absolutely non-substantial. Thinking that it is a thing, a res, a substance, is what Descartes' substantialistic fallacy consisted in, already analyzed by Husserl in the beginning of the Cartesianische Meditation. It is, in some sense, says Sartre, consciousness is nothing since all physical and psychophysical objects, all truths, all values exist outside of it. This is extreme externalistic realism. The consciousness's own existence, being void of substance, is borrowed, emprunté, is borrowed from the existence of outer things. The consciousness is a parasite sitting on outer objects, which alone exists, and lend to the consciousness a kind of existence, a secondary existence, un moindre être, a minor being, says Sartre. Consciousness has no content of its own. All content it reflects in the diet, reflected is representational. This is a very intransparent piece of Sartre's theory, and nearly nobody has ever taken the time to analyze it properly. I did. It's the reflétant, which plays a major role in the theory of consciousness. And if you don't know it, you are typical for the readers of Sartre. But differently than Taine, Sartre has an answer to the question how consciousness can be immediately familiar with itself, and not only with the surfaces of physical objects over there, over against there. It owes its transparency precisely to its non-objectuality. As objects, in a principal way, first are outside of it, and second are opaque due to their multifacetedness. Consciousness is empty. He follows the fourth logical investigation of Husserl. Who says object says probable. Who says consciousness says certain. This is a quotation of Husserl. Why are objects never certain? Because you never embrace restlessly the entireties of aspects through which objects present themselves to the mind. This is different if the mind has no aspects at all, but is transparent. It just looks through itself like through a mirror glass, which is very clear. It is empty. So knowing that you are empty and knowing that the object is opaque are two sides of one and the same experience. Okay. Like Burge, Sartre has no problem with combining the Cartesian stance, there is some basic self-awareness, with Theis and Dretski's externalist stance. Everything consciousness is aware of is external. Self-consciousness is content-preserving. It has not a second content, it is empty. There's nothing to say about what the content of consciousness in itself is. It's just the preservation of the so-called primary object of Brentano's so-called primary object. Here is where talk of the diet reflétant comes in. Outer objects have a face turned away from consciousness, which makes the content wider. And a face turned toward consciousness. This is what makes the content narrow, accessible to consciousness. The phenomenal content, says Sartre, reflects the representational one, the roughness, the rawness, the softness, the sweetness, the hardness, the coldness of the surface of this desk. The phenomenal content reflects the representational one, so slightly modifying it, since only as a reflex is the opaque object accessible to consciousness and compatible with the conditions of epistemic transparency. My comment: the diet reflected, reflétant, even though it is a two-term relation, is of no harm to the transparency of consciousness as long as nothing objectual or real or substantial is reflected. And as soon as some real thing is reflected, the consciousness expels it as that with which it is not committed to coincide. So self-consciousness is just the negation of heteroconsciousness, in that heteroconsciousness is what is not inside the dyad reflet, reflétant, but outside. It is reflected, but is not the reflecting, the Gehalt itself. With this project, I end up what I've tried to sketch so far. It demands thorough elaboration, of course. Of course, I know that this is just an attempt. But I think it points out a way of reconciling insistence on the non-relational or irreflective structure of diaphanous self-awareness with its fully spelled out nature as representation of the outer reality. Thank you for your patience.